Just when we thought we understood what was going on, we get this episode. Welcome back to the channel. My name is Sean Redmond. This is Sean's Take. Today my take is on Constellation, episode 7, entitled Through the Looking Glass. And we really are through the looking glass. This is your spoiler warning. I'll assume that you've seen the episode from here on out. I will also use clips from the show, as is allowed under the copyright laws of 1976, as they are for fair use. Let's dig in. And boy, oh boy, oh boy. We were talking about there being 2, possibly 3 realities. There are at least 5 realities. I'll prove it here in a minute. And a couple of timelines. And we haven't talked about the timelines being different. Mostly because I missed it till now. But it turns out that one accident on the ISS happened in October of 2020. And one happened in 2023.
10th of the 15th, 2021.
Okay. And as we unfold all of this, I mentioned that I didn't know why Alice was being affected by an experiment that went funny on the ISS. But several of you pointed out in the comments, and I thank you for that, Alice was there. She was on the tablet. She witnessed the cow and the accident and whatever it was that happened. So that does explain a bit why Alice is involved. But what it doesn't explain, well, no, I guess it does, because Yaz and the other astronauts that were on the ISS didn't witness it. Alice did. Joe did. Paul did. So we run over a lot of the same ground often in this episode, but with different people, with different realities, with different timelines. So just to refresh a little, we refer to the primary reality that we have watched through most of the episodes as blue, because that's the reality in which Joe's family car is blue. And we refer to the other one as red because the car was red, or is red. So we get a little help. Alice Blue, from the reality where the car is blue, wears a blue stocking cap. And Alice from Red reality now wears her deceased mother's snow hat, the Russian-looking flapped fur. So that's how we know the two of them. And that becomes important when we are through the looking glass a little later in the episode. So there are a couple of versions of Joe. So there's Blue Joe, who's really Red Joe. So and that's where it really starts to get confusing. So the Joe that we've been watching all along is from the red reality, where she remembers her car being red. She now lives in the blue reality. So we call her Blue Joe. Red Joe, the Joe that returned or didn't return, is red. So Red Alice thinks her mother is dead, but has a live Joe. No, I said that wrong. Blue Alice has a live Joe, but in reality, her mother is Joe that's deceased. And we know we're in blue in 2023 because it's set it on phones. They've set it in the hearing with Joe. But then in this episode later, when they put in the tape that has her name on it, and it's from October 2021, and it has her name on it, and they put it in and listen to it, and it's actually Paul discussing what to do with the dead body, which is Joe. So in the reality where Joe died, she died 2 years ago. Okay. And here, so there's so many things overlapping that if you think you saw something, you probably did. Because we saw the opening shot of the series was Joe and Alice, which was Blue Joe, well, Red Joe alive in the blue reality with Blue Alice, driving to the cabin, listening to tapes. That Joe had a scar on her cheek. In this episode, when we do the same trip, she doesn't. Okay? Yeah. And we get to a cabin. Oh, this is important. And I didn't realize this till this episode. These paintings. And I don't know if you feel like I'm harping on the paintings or not, but they were pointed out as being significant. And as it turns out, they really are significant. But I just missed a big piece all along until this episode. There are 2 paintings in every cabin. So when they get to the cabin and they open the door, the painting across, which is the one we saw first, right? There's the painting that faces the door, and then there's the one over the fireplace that faces the cabin, right? So in our primary reality, the blue reality, the one that faces the door is the wounded angel, where the angel is being carried on the stretcher by the two boys. The one boy's looking where they're going, the other boy's looking at the viewer, right? That's the wounded angel. That's an actual painting, and they're going. In that cabin, on the wall above the fireplace, is Demon by the Pot, which they refer to in this series as the Changeling, as it's painted that we can go see it, with the demon holding the kettle next to the fireplace, looking back over his shoulder at the, we assume, the homeowners. And that's that reality. In the red reality, they are those paintings half switched. We have the demon on the stretcher being carried by the two boys on the wall facing the door. And then above the fireplace facing the cabin, we see for the first time in this episode, the wounded angel by the fireplace with the homeowners, right? So that's the center point of the paintings is swapped. There is also a reality where the demon by the pot, Changeling, is on the wall facing the door, and the wounded angel is on the wall above the fireplace. And then there's one where the two are switched and switched. So where we see this most clearly, later in this episode, we see Alice with the blue cap in the cabinet with the tape player. We see Alice with the fur cap in the cabinet with the tape player. And they're talking to each other through the tape recorder and the mirror. So that's two different realities. Then we see Magnus and Joe open those cabinets. So those are two different realities. However, neither one of those cabinets have an Alice in them. There's just a tape deck. So we have Alice with tape deck reality, Alice with tape deck reality, Magnus with tape deck reality, Joe with tape deck reality. It's a lot. It's a lot, and it keeps coming. And I believe there's more. I mean, when we start folding in the timelines and the other things, it really does get hard to talk about. I mean, I've struggled to get this together because there's so many rabbit holes you can crawl down, which, by the way, falling down a rabbit hole is another Alice in Wonderland reference. And we are truly through the looking glass now. So, we have all of the pieces coming together of all of the things that we've learned. It's sort of a loop-de-loop when you go out of the cabin and you make your way back to the cabin. And what wasn't clear in the first couple episodes is when we saw the high shots and the tree line where the cabin is, that's the lake, right? That's not just a field, that's the frozen lake, and they keep coming out of the cabin and crossing that lake. I don't know if the frozen lake is going to matter in the final episode, but Joe did we've been driving on that frozen lake a lot, but I guess we've established that it's frozen. So yeah, I have my coffee. I am caffeinated. I hope you have a beverage of your choice and you're enjoying this. Sit back and relax. This one is, I think this is why, these conversations is why we had the twins playing Alice. Although I thought they would actually be a little more in the same room, but this was good. And of course I did notice that the bead that Alice drops when Joe's looking for the Alice that speaks Swedish, and Blue Alice is smart enough to drop breadcrumbs, right? Using her beads. That the bead that she dropped, that Swedish speaking Alice finds in the snow, was red. I don't know if that was intentional. It feels like everything's intentional in this show. Like nothing's an accident. So we saw at the end of the last episode, we saw Bud Caldera shoot a gun in the direction of Paul. We find out in this episode that he shot Paul in the stomach, and Paul's laying on the floor. But at the moment that he fired the gun, he and Henry, Bud and Henry, swapped places. Now, this confused me a little, and I fell down a rabbit hole here too. So Bud being in our show's primary timeline, and Henry now being with Paul, laying on the floor bleeding, means that those two characters are back in their correct realities. However, that would mean that the Henry we've been watching, obsessed with the cow, dancing with Irina, right, talking to Alice about quantum physics, is the Henry whose crew died. And Bud is the hero that saved his crew, but returned to the wrong reality. Yeah, I know. Go back and watch. So let's talk about that. So we had Henry explain to Alice on the swings about a white particle, a black particle, and a black and white particle, and it doesn't choose its state until it's observed. I think that matters in the final scene of this show, this episode. And then we had, I just lost my train of thought. We had somebody explaining quantum physics. I guess it was Joe. But that's, so the thing I wanted to get to is in this episode, Joe, who was on a space station that did not have the cow, is sitting at a table with Blue Alice, who does not speak Swedish. Okay? So Joe that lived never had a cow, didn't know what it was. It wasn't an experiment on her space station, which is why she didn't know what it was when Sup asked her to bring it home. She said, "What is it?" "Yeah, it's the NASA experiment, blah, 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 blah. The CAL. So she doesn't know what a CAL is, so she didn't study it. She doesn't know what it does. Except in that conversation, sitting at that table with Alice, she explains that it's an experiment to capture a particle in a super state. And the super state is, the Schrodinger's cat is both alive and dead at the same time until it's observed. That's the super state. Except this Joe wouldn't know that that's what that experiment is. She may understand quantum physics to be able to explain it, but she wouldn't know that Cal is doing that's what it's doing. So I thought that was a bit of a mistake. However, we did need to introduce that super state, and we needed to remind people of that super state. So we just took that leap of faith and got on with it. However, when you're dealing with this many realities, when you start mixing up what the characters know like that, that's mean to the viewers. It really is. When we're trying to keep track of the different realities you're presenting us, the characters can't suddenly know stuff they shouldn't know, unless you tell us why they now know it. So we did talk about the super state, and we get to see a reality in a super state. When Joe is running back into the burning cabin and she kicks the door open and the flames vanish, right? And then the flames are gone, but she looks in the picture and sees the reflection of the flames burning. That's a super state. She's in a super state. And then, of course, when we're outside in the snow and Joe's trying to save Blue Alice from the smoke inhalation and the cold, and Red Alice is there and can see her, the two of them, and they can talk. We're in a super state. And when Magnus comes up and Joe says, "Go to your father," he sees Joe. He's not as mixed up in everything to be believing what he's seeing yet, but he sees her there. And then later she says, Alice says, "Did you see her?" And he says, "I don't know." So he has at least the beginning of the realization. So I'm not going to go through beat by beat with this episode because it gets so circular and it gets hard to break down and not lose yourself in the description, that I'm just sort of talking about all the things I found interesting in this show and what the heck is going to happen in the next show. Hey, by the way, if you're enjoying this episode, give it a thumbs up, and in the comments, let me know what you like about this episode or this video of mine, either way. And if you really like all of these, hit the subscribe button and the notification so you know when we drop new ones. All right, because we're going to move on to the 3-body problem. Hopefully that's good. I am going to do the final season of Star Trek Discovery. Not everybody's cup of tea, but, we know it's the final season, so we'll pick it up. And let me know what other shows you're going to be watching. I'm hoping The Acolyte is good, although I fear it will not be. All right, but let's get back into this. So Bud and Henry swap places. So Joe, coming out of the burning building, sees Henry Caldera and hands her daughter, Alice, to Henry and says, "Take her. I have to go save Alice." Okay. And Henry turns and starts to walk out. However, it's at this time that the swap happens, and Bud shoots Paul. And at the moment he shoots Paul, that's when the switch happens for him. And he becomes Henry, and Bud is now carrying Alice. And he throws her to the ground and says, "Who are you, kid?" Complains about being in his underwear or something, and then wanders off to go find the cow. Henry, now realizing that Paul is lying shot, calls an ambulance to save his life. Doesn't know the address, doesn't have his glasses because Bud needs glasses. Doesn't know his address, So hopefully he saved Paul, but that's not going to go well for him in that universe. He's now thrown one guy over a ship that Henry doesn't know he did, and shot a guy, which Henry does know he did. And I thought the retelling or the reshowing of, yeah, so we see again when Joe gets to Alice in the cabinet the first time, right? And she's freezing, and Joe takes her back to the other cabin and puts her in the bath to warm her up, and then has to go get more water. And we see Alice look at the reflection. I think it was the reflection, or it was the window with a reflection, but we see two of Joe that Alice is looking at. And then that's when Magnus, Alice is sitting in the bath water, and then suddenly there's no water because she slipped realities, right? And she gets up to go look for her mother, and Magnus is there because now we're back in that cabin, and he wraps her in a blanket, right? And the one cabin has power, in the other reality it doesn't have power. But we walked into several of this cabin. We walked into, so both the one that Magnus is in and the one that Joe is in, there's no cat. There is no cat. We walk into the dilapidated cabin one time, and there's a dead cat, very decayed. We walk into that cabin seemingly again, and there is a live cat that scampers away. We walk into that cabin again and see a dead cat that's not quite decayed and a live cat. I mean, this is so obviously Schrodinger's cat. Cat's alive, cat's dead, cat's both alive and dead. But those are all different realities for that cabin, right? And I guess that's the 2021 cabin in 2023 after it's been abandoned for a few years. So if you go back and rewatch this series, and pay attention to the dates people say, and that's, these days it's hard. We get used to just sort of blurring over things, but when writers take their time, we miss things. And we've heard the date all along. They've specifically told us that it's 2023 and it's 2021. And they've done things like the makeup with the scar, the things. There were other things too. Yeah, when Alice left Joe out in the cold and returned to the cabin, they showed the light bulb the one time, and there's icicles coming off the protector. And then they show the exact same shot again another time, and there's no icicles. Different reality, right? And that's literally the shot that made me think of the ice on the lake, because the icicles disappeared, right? It was no longer as frozen. Maybe we don't need anything about the lake, is the answer. That it was just frozen to show us that, Magnus's answer is get a digger and clear the road. Joe's answer was drive across the lake. Just, we do see Bud on the frozen lake find the cow. We don't do anything with it, and I think Bud was laying on the ice, motionless, when Joe found Alice to revive her. There's somebody laying there. And there's a lot of things with the fire of the cabin. So when Joe's driving across the ice and she looks in the mirror and sees the fire, it's huge. She donuts around and drives back to get there to find it just in the dining room, to kick open the door to find it not there at all, except in the reflections of the paintings. And it seeps into the cabinet where Alice is. And I thought that scene with Alice, discovering Alice and discovering she can talk to her through the tape deck. And, I think this girl's doing a really good job as Alice, or these girls. And we have the conversation where the Blue Alice reveals that she believes your mom is still alive and it's my mom that's dead. And then, Fur Hat Alice says, Can I have my mom back, please?
Can I have her back?
And that was a heartstring moment, And then a little tough outside when Joe sees Blue Alice unconscious, and she starts applying CPR, and then she sees Red Alice, the Swedish-speaking, her reality daughter Alice, calling to her, and she says, "No, I have to save her. Go to your father," knowing that she may not be able to undo it and get back to that reality. So then we travel to hospital and see Alice, presumably Blue Alice, with Magnus in a hospital recovering, sleeping, unobserved, let's say, for a second. And she, quote unquote, dreams about somebody asking to take her if she wants to go to her mother. And it's the cosmonaut. It's the dead cosmonaut, Irina, who really is kind of scary. And then Alice wakes up because she's now observed. And that's where we leave it. That's where we leave the show. That's where we leave the episode. So it's interesting that in the red reality, no, the red reality is where Irina died and Joe lived. Hang with me. And then the blue reality is the one where Irina is alive and Joe's dead, except that Joe has slipped. Like Joe's in the wrong reality. So, what do you think? How are we going to do it? What are we going to do in the final episode? I suspect we're going to leave room for a season 2. I sure hope they do. But what I'm not sure is what we're going to clean up season 1. You know, is Joe going to get back to her reality? Is everything going to snap back? Because it almost seemed like, you know, everything's going and then it'll just snap back. I don't know. We'll see what the writers have in store for us. You know, leave a comment what you think's going to happen. You know, that'll be our sheet of integrity next week when we're all wrong. I think one more person will slip to the correct reality before this season is over, leaving room for more seasons and things. What do you think? Anyway, so that's episode 7, Through the Looking Glass. So next week, if you want a little homework, next week episode is a quote from T.S. Eliot, of all people. Let me find it here. Come on. Episode. So the final episode of the season is called These Fragments I Have Shored Against My Ruin. These fragments I have shored against my ruin. Okay, so if you care, that is from a poem by T.S. Eliot called The Wasteland. That's interesting. It's a very long, epic poem. T.S. Eliot wrote Cats, for any of you who aren't familiar. He wrote an epic poem in a book called Cats, and then was converted into a musical for Broadway. He didn't write a Broadway musical. He wrote a poem. So this is The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot. And if I'm not mistaken, these fragments I have shored against my ruin, why then ill fit you? Oh boy. It's the last line of The Wasteland. So that's interesting. May have to read it, but it's like 100 some lines. And it's not all easy poetry to read. But we'll dig into that. So if you want to read it, some homework for you. See if it plays a part in next week's episode. But that's it for now. My name's Sean. This is Sean's Take. I'll see you next time.